Good morning for my online government classes here in the spring 2016 semester. I'm recording this lecture here for Chapter 7 on a beautiful February 18th morning. Just looks fantastic outside, very spring-like here today. Chapter 7, we're moving on into one more recorded lecture in Chapter 8, which we'll have next week. And we will have then the first half of the semester that we'll be covering for our midterm exams. So Chapter 7, the media. It's a lot of power and responsibility for the media, as I'm sure, aware of, and many stories that are out there that help to encapsulate this whole idea of the power and responsibility of the media. But perhaps one of the best stories deals with Edward Snowden, the coverage of Edward Snowden, who was a contractor for the National Security Agency, and he believed that the National Security Agency was violating the Fourth Amendment rights of many Americans. He's now living in Russia. He's turned his information and story over to media sources such as, and you see Edward Snowden here on the left, and there you have Glenn Greenwald, a reporter for Guardian magazine, which we have, a Guardian newspaper, which we have as an electronic source on our web page. So how much information do we have a right to know about our government? And how much information does the media have a right to report about our government? Some very important questions. So I would urge you to spend some time reading about this story and going on to The Guardian and other sources and get some more information about this story. The power and responsibility of the media can also be played out to look at stories such as reporting of the troop levels in a country like North Korea, which is what James Rosen did a couple of years ago. And on its own, that doesn't seem to be a major issue, but he did go on to say that the way that we, the United States, knew of the troop levels and the troop movements in North Korea was because of our human resources on the ground. So human intelligence, spies. Now, I think we probably know that we have spies in North Korea, but should a reporter report that and let people know that, in fact, we do have spies in North Korea, and in a way clarify that or legitimize that for the North Koreans in the reporting? So again, we're left with that issue of power and responsibility. Just because you can do something, should you do that? And that's a major issue, of course, brought out in the elections of the United States, and the reporting of the United States, and what is the role of the media. Same thing can be said then in showing bloodshed and the residue of bombing, the aftermath, and the people who have died. When this is done, and this particular picture here is showing the aftermath of the use of chemical warfare, chemical weapons in Syria by the dictatorship of Syria against its own people, the Assad regime, against people within his own country in Syria. One of the issues there is what dead bodies are shown. In this case, we show then the aftermath of our enemy and how he has used weapons. Do we have the same responsibility to show the aftermath of when the United States uses weapons? And if people are dead as a result of the use of weapons, does it matter what type of weapon was used? And so again, we can look at the responsibility and the questions raised on the role of the media when it comes to especially covering controversial stories. And what should be covered and what is controversial, how important are particular stories. This, of course, is a joke here, but it does always lead us to that question of the power of the media, and part of their power is what stories are they covering, to what degree are they covering these stories. So as the joke here says, as the U.S. heads towards military action in Syria, The media asked, did Miley Cyrus go too far on MTV last night? How far, what stories should be covered, and to what degree? And this was, of course, an issue about a year or two ago now. And it's still, I think, an interesting story about the media, not so much the event itself, although that's important. After all, we are talking about a fairly well-known figure, a very well-known athlete at one time in his life, who has now made a sex change, a gender alteration or change. And so as a result, that becomes a big story, I would think, to some degree, on the transformation. Are there other people in this situation? How frequent does this occur? What is the process involved here? How much money does this normally cost? Can people with minimal means of income make this change if they so desire? What's involved in this? So I don't know how much time and space in the news this should have covered, but I can clearly see that it's a story worthy of some coverage. And in a way, you can debate this in your head or maybe debate this with your friends. Yes, can you say that this is not newsworthy? How important of a story is this overall? That's another question. But you got to figure that there would have been members of Vanity Fair magazine, the editorial staff, sitting around a table saying, this is why it's an important story, this is why we're going with it. And there's no doubt part of the reason why they thought this was an important story, it will capture the attention of the public and it will sell magazines. And as it sells magazines, it sells advertisers and sells advertising space. So that can be a major reason why one story is picked over another. This then leads to the reality that our news is a mixture of information and entertainment, infotainment. That's generally the case in the United States. Most news sources do need to sell advertising. And in fact, a major part of their business cycle or their business impact is, in fact, their ability to sell advertising. If they don't sell advertising, it doesn't matter how good their stories might be. So this becomes a key part of the reality of the news business. The media also, of course, is controlled by a few major corporations, most parts of the media. And this is brought out in Chapter 7, so certainly focus on this as you read through this chapter, the mass media. And this is involving, of course, electronic sources. This is involving newspapers. It's involving radio, television, web blogs. And so who controls most of the parts of the mass media? Well, these are some of the major news corporations. So spend some time looking over this chart here, and you can see that you have a large amount of money being generated by a few companies. And on here, we're looking at 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 companies. Some of these companies, not even part of the United States, really. They're started off in other countries. News Corp, Bertelsmann, 2 good examples there. But billions of dollars being generated then by these news corporations. Now, one of the ways of looking at this is that these huge corporations can then not be intimidated by advertisers. If you were a small organization, you had one newspaper and you were able to stay in business because of a few advertisers, then if those advertisers didn't want certain stories in the paper, you're probably not going to publish them. But there's really not an advertiser out there that can push some of these companies around unless you had a consistent effort to try to block advertisements from certain groups, let's say. But more than likely, they're not going to get intimidated. And so that can lead to a benefit of having major corporations controlling parts of the news. However, they can also decide what they are going to cover. The technology has led to changes in the news business. It's led to changes in reporting. And one of the ways of looking at that, we're probably aware of that in so many different ways. I mean, technology right here is showing us how we deliver class material has changed. But here for Chicago Sun-Times, one of the 2 major newspapers in the city of Chicago, they laid off about 25 photographers. After there was just a realization that a reporter could go out to a news site and either take pictures himself or herself, or the newspaper could buy pictures from citizen journalists who would just have their cell phone and take a picture. Is it the same thing? Well, as far as they were concerned, it's good enough. And so people lost their jobs as a result of the technology. And now we, as consumers of the news, have either other sources of the photographs, or we just learn to live with a different change in the technology there. So citizen journalism, as we can just mention there, they can take a picture, send it to a newspaper, or they can go to a different source entirely. Go on a weblog, maybe start their own web page, post it, and there you can see pictures of some particular event. This, of course, is really changing our journalism, and everyone then can be an active journalist. This could have been the case years ago, of course, as long as there's been a camera, and it's also been the case as long as somebody wants to provide an eyewitness account. But the immediacy of reporting today through citizen journalism and the technology is much greater than it's ever been. And on page 270, you'll see this reporting, or this writing about citizen journalism here, involving the coverage of what's called the pepper spray cop. And so people took this picture, posted it online, and people were now getting evidence about the attempt to break up a student protest in a California university. And this also is a good example of a meme. Humorous image copied, usually altered, and spread rapidly by internet users. So there were many memes started from the pepper spray cop, such as here with My Little Pony, Sound of Music, on down the list. Go online and you can check all kinds of memes for the pepper spray cop. We're going to have some discussion about the pepper spray cop in our class discussions here next week, actually, so we'll see that. History of the media, the partisan press. One of the ways of looking at the media, how it's changed over the years, is again through technology. And we can see here that the beginning part of the press, it was laborious and time-consuming. I mean, it took a lot of work to put the paper out there. Just literally, you are pressing down on a sheet of paper with the letter blocks and the ink that's blotted on the letter blocks. So there's some real work involved. And in the process, you had very few people at the beginning of our country, 1700s, late 1700s to around 1830, 1840, in that time period. Had very few people that would read newspapers that much, and it was hard to deliver newspapers. Papers were very localized, for example. So because of that, the media would be the press, which was really, that's the only source of the media at the time, would be owned by the political parties, hence the name partisan press. And so the partisan press, you have a case here in which the newspapers are not really here to try to find the truth. They're here to really promote one political party over the other. And so that's important, of course, when we think of our research, you know, what's happening. And if you're getting information from newspapers from the late 1700s, it's important to note what political party was controlling that one newspaper. This starts to change with the changes in technology. You have rotary press, you have the telegraph, you have the railroad, so now you can get information much faster, you can disperse information much faster. And again, you really only have the newspaper, though, as the source of the media. So there's a lot of competition among newspapers, and there's a way now to make money from newspapers. So you have businesses involved in newspapers. You have entrepreneurs buying newspapers and using this as a way of competing. You had roughly 12 or 13 daily newspapers in the late 1800s in the city of New York. So it is a competitive time, and you would have had boys like this, the newsies, out there trying to sell one newspaper over another. Very affordable as well, as we can see, the penny press. So it's very competitive. A lot of people involved in newspapers today. It's the only source of information, really, and it's also affordable. So we can see why it's the golden age of newspapers. This leads to yellow journalism, sensationalist journalism. So there's still that question of how important is the truth overall. If you have stories where you have some facts that you know, but there's a lot of facts you just don't know, and there's a lot of holes in a story, let's say, you may know why, or you may know who, but you don't know what, where, or why in a particular story. Well, you know, sensationalist journalists, yellow journalism, what they might do is just fill in those gaps and come up with some explanations as to why particular events occurred the way they did. So maybe stretch the truth or make things up. And this was one of the first colored cartoons called The Yellow Boy, and that was some of the connection to the description of yellow journalism. One of the events of yellow journalism that we oftentimes place at the feet of yellow journalism is the Spanish-American War. You had major newspapers that did have one fact, and that is that the USS Maine, a battleship that was in Havana Harbor in Cuba, which was a colony of Spain, did explode, and it did sink, and many sailors and Marines died. Those are all facts. What caused the explosion, no one knew. And so that was something that was suggested and sensationalized to try to attract people to this story and to generate an enthusiasm towards a war, which it certainly led to, the Spanish-American War in the late 1800s, and the first major event to get the United States onto the world stage. These two individuals that are depicted in that cartoon that you just saw were two newspaper men who were largely supportive of this war. And William Randolph Hearst of the New York Journal and Joseph Pulitzer of the New York World. They were trying to get the United States to be involved in the Spanish-American War. So this is an event that you oftentimes, the Spanish-American War, that you tie to yellow journalism. It's a great movie. If you'd like to just see a fictionalized way of viewing the creation of powerful newspapers and powerful newspaper men and the use of yellow journalism, please look at this movie here, Citizen Kane. It's oftentimes considered, in almost all charts, a top 10 movie of all time. Orson Welles is the main actor in the movie, and he's the producer and director of the movie as well. So it's a fantastic movie to watch. It is really connected to the life of William Randolph Hearst. It's a fictionalized version of that individual's life. So again, I'd strongly suggest that you watch the movie. This is one of those cases where fiction really helps to deliver a historical example of what life was like and what journalism was like during the lifetime of William Randolph Hearst. Well, let's look at some descriptions here of the power of the media and how the media is used in our political world here in the United States. And so we'll give you some terms here that you may not find in the book, so certainly be aware of that. Pack journalism, the tendency for the press to cover the same stories. So the press may start to look at certain stories and they take a life of their own, and they start to get more attention than perhaps they really deserve. The O.J. Simpson murder trial was a case in which, when it's all said and done, it's a terrible situation. You have some people losing their lives, but what overall impact does it have to the country? I suppose you can argue that it had some sort of cultural impact, but it certainly got a lot of attention. And how much attention did it really deserve? And perhaps part of the reason for that attention is that the press started to cover the story because other parts of the press were covering the story. And so it just took, like I said, took on a life of its own. It's like a wildfire out of control. The same can be said about the Scott Peterson murder trial, in which he was convicted of killing his wife, Laci Peterson. A terrible story, a great tragedy. But it's still a murder, and it's involving one victim. And so how much time should it cover for the whole most of the American media. And so that's always some of the questions about PAC journalism. Do some stories get more attention than they really deserve because the press covers the story because other parts of the press are covering the story? There we go, PAC journalism. And this was an interesting story a few years back. You can go back online and check. I don't know, maybe it's 10 years ago now that it happened. But for one afternoon, it just seemed to capture a good portion of the media, this possibility the little boy was somehow caught in a weather balloon. And so the media was covering police chasing this weather balloon, trying to get the weather balloon. The boy wasn't in the weather balloon. There was, of course, some real questions. How could the little boy be in the weather balloon to begin with? But nevertheless, the press starts to cover this story. We better cover this story. We better get on top of the story because if we don't, somebody else is, and they're going to scoop this story. They're going to get this attention instead of us. So let's make sure that we get out there in front of that story. Certainly in this campaign year, here I am recording this lecture a couple of days before the South Carolina Republican primary and the Nevada Democrat caucus, and that's going to be held on the Saturday, the 20th. So it's a big story, and it gets a lot of coverage. Horse race journalism. How much coverage should there be on this particular event? And of course it is important. Who's going to be our next president here in the United States? Who's winning these primaries? Who's getting more attention in the public opinion polls than somebody else? So again, the question is, how much coverage should there be? I know a couple of days ago, I happened to just watch BBC, which is British Broadcasting Corporation. Their top story was the reporting of surface-to-air missiles on islands in the South China Sea and East China Sea by the country of China. And then I turned over to American news, and it was how Donald Trump was doing in the polls in South Carolina. Now, I don't know really overall what is the most important story, but again, from the American point of view, there was an argument made, this is who we got to cover, who's ahead and who's behind. And so while it is an important story, just like with PAC journalism, there's always that issue to say how much time really should be devoted to these particular stories. So in some regard, a campaign is going to be a horse race. One candidate will win, all other candidates will lose. So there is a need then to cover that. And so also you can assume that there are people who want this story to be covered because after all, they're investing in a campaign and they may want to know if their candidate has an opportunity to actually win. If they don't, then maybe they don't want to give that campaign contribution as well. So that we can see the importance of horse race journalism. The media also serves as a gatekeeper. They get to decide who's in and who's out of the political arena. And this last year has been a great example of the gatekeeper. So who gets to participate in the political arena? Just like bouncers at a nightclub. Who gets to go into the nightclub, who doesn't? They might decide that some people are worthy of going into that nightclub and other people aren't. So who gets to be on the stage? So I'm sure many of you have followed that story throughout this whole year. Who gets to be on the big stage and who gets to be on the little kids' table for a debate in the Republican primary. Since they started off, there was 11 people running for president. They didn't want, most news coverage, news organizations didn't want all 11 on the stage at one time. So they would narrow it down to 5 or 6 or what have you. Actually, at one time there were 17 candidates for president. So they narrowed it down to having 10 on the stage. Now with debates, there's 6, and there's pretty much 6 left going into this weekend here on February 20th. So I'm recording these lectures in the summer, would have had 17, now we're down to 6. There's, in a way, kind of a natural winnowing process, but part of it also was involved on who was getting that coverage over others. The press could come back and say public opinion polls were the reasons why they decided some candidates got on the stage and others didn't. That wasn't always consistent by some of the news organizations. But clearly we can see the power of the media. They're holding a debate. Who gets to be on the stage, who doesn't. And if you're not on that stage, you've got to sense that you're not going to do very well. And after all, the 6 candidates are left. I don't think any of them were ever at what was referred to as the second debate, where you would just invite people over and they'd sit on the couch and talk about their vision of America, but they weren't participating in the major debate. Power of the media, the gatekeeper. Media also serves as investigative journalism, finding out what's happening in a major event, going underground, let's say, or under coverage to get a story. And so working in the meatpacking industry is probably a better way of getting the story than to interview the owners of a meatpacking factory, let's say, or even to interview the workers. That workers may be rather concerned about voicing their true feelings about their job. So then to go undercover and to work at the meatpacking plant is a way of getting that information. Is this as part of the First Amendment, or is this undermining the business? That and it does mean that people might be working there under false pretenses. So should that be allowed as well? And some of the questions that are involved in the legitimacy of investigative journalism. But clearly, we have seen changes in our society as a result of having reporters do these type of actions. So what life might have been like in a tenement apartment over 100 years ago in a place like New York City or Boston, somewhere like that, no ventilation, very little safety, very little lighting, no escape routes if the apartment caught on fire. Is there a need to know what the safety is like, what it's like to live there? It would be one thing to interview the owner of the apartment and find out, or even to interview the people who live there. It would be another to say, well, let's write about what life is like in a tenement apartment by living there for a year, or living there for a month and seeing what life is like. So we see some of that going on today when we look at stories or programs like To Catch a Predator, where you have someone working as working with the police officers and reporting of their process of trying to catch someone who's a pedophile. And is there a better opportunity to know about this story by having someone pose as potential victim and then filming that event? And we now know more about it by again, the false pretenses that are involved in getting this story. There is no underage girl really involved here. And there are people lying about their connection to the media and to the police. But is it worthwhile to find out about these kind of individuals and the potential harm that they could cause for others and overall to our society? So again, what is the role of muckraking? What's the role of investigative journalism? A novel that really brought home the point about life as for people working in the slaughterhouses. It's a really good novel, The Jungle, by Upton Sinclair, and describes that life and the harshness of that life. And clearly, his writing was based on reporting that other people had observed of the difficult lives working in slaughterhouses, and how then we should be considering changes using regulations and to ensure safety. And while Sinclair was mostly concerned about the safety and health of the workers, for many people who read this or read reports about this book, what they were mostly concerned about was the safety of their meat. And that's still very important, of course, and we now have regulations as a result of somebody's reporting involving the meatpacking industry. Some other things then about the impact of the media. Television hypothesis. The more television a person watches, the less he or she knows about public affairs. This whole idea connects to Chapter 6, looking at public opinion polls. So the television hypothesis, a hypothesis is a prediction. So the prediction here is the more someone watches, the less he or she knows. Now, the only way that you would really be able to determine if this hypothesis is correct is to do surveys. And so you would interview people and or call them up on the phone, let's say, or maybe have an electronic survey online, a blog, and ask people, how much TV do you watch per night and or per day? Let's say that somebody watches 6 hours of TV a day. It's 1/4 of their day watching TV. And then so then they're asked, okay, then how much do you know about public affairs? Maybe ask them, who's the governor of your state? What's involved? What's the Fifth Amendment entail? On down the list. Give them 10 questions, and the fewer that they're able to answer, if you can see a correlation there, more TV, you can answer less questions, then perhaps you're onto something, that it is in fact people who watch more TV tend to know less about public affairs. But the question even there could be, does that mean that somebody who watches a lot of TV, the TV somehow causes people to be ignorant about public affairs? It could just mean that the people who watch more TV choose programming that does leave them ignorant about public affairs. So there could be people out there who do watch a lot of TV, but they're watching C-SPAN or History Channel or something like that that might provide a lot of information and actually have them more aware of public affairs in that case. So there's some real questions there about the use of the television hypothesis. But it's an interesting study and the impact that TV may have on our lives. A couple of other things here dealing with the power of the media. Framing on page 282, the power of the media to influence how events and issues are interpreted. So certainly focus on that. Look at these issues here. Wherever you work, whatever media that you use the most, and how it's depicting things such as healthcare reform, healthcare rationing, death panels. The studies would show that if you're less likely to support the Affordable Care Act if the media that you're consuming frames this story as a death panel, then you're viewing this as not a good public policy. So the media and how it frames a particular story is going to have an impact on how people then would view that policy. Priming, also the process of preparing the public to take a particular view of an event or political actor. So again, investigations here about the use of the media, was the media priming the American public for an invasion into Iraq in the early 2000s. All kinds of stories about how evil of a man Saddam Hussein was, how cruel he was to his own people, and then led to greater beliefs that there should be something done. And so getting people ready for that event, the power of priming. And this leads us to the question of media and war. What should be done during the time of war and the coverage in the media? And what we do see is that when the public is asked, should the American media support the war effort or just cover the story from a neutral perspective, regardless of what it might mean to the overall war effort? When the wars first start, most of the public wants the media to be supportive of the war. But as wars drag on, we see evidence that the public wants the media to have a neutral perspective on the war and to just cover the war, warts and all. And if it means that some parts of the military and some parts of military contracting don't come out looking so well, that's fine. We have a right to know that. So again, we're left with that question that we started this whole lecture over. How much information do we have a right to know about our government? And in this part, the extension of the government, the military. So what is the greater morality, to report the truth or support your country? The truth may mean that things aren't going well. And should the media cover that when it comes to war? Sir Winston Churchill said that when there's a war, the first victim is the truth. That's the very first victim. And so is that our situation here in the United States as well? Is that our first victim when we go to war? And how much truth are we able to consume, and how much truth should we be able to consume? So the photos of the My Lai massacre, for example, this came out many months after the event had occurred. And there were some real questions about this, but this coverage did take place in the late 1960s, after the Vietnam War had been going on for certainly for many years, the aggressive stages of the war for many years there. And the war would go on for a few years afterwards. It certainly did turn many people against the war. And do we have a right to know if in our name, service people are killing civilians? And so some of the big questions that certainly were raised in the Vietnam era and are still with us today. Last, we're going to look here at the power of the media through agenda setting, page 281. So note that, again, the power of the media to bring public attention to particular issues and problems. And so things such as child obesity has certainly been covered in the news to a great degree in recent years, or certain kinds of drug usage, meth for many years, and recently a lot of coverage on heroin. So there we can see the power of the media to bring this to our attention. What should be done, if anything, about these particular issues? All right, we'll stop there. This is Chapter 7. And we'll be moving on into Chapter 8, looking at voting behavior. So we'll be covering that for next week. If you have any questions, as always, you know where to find me, and please do contact me.